It's 9:57 p.m. David, Sébastien, Marie, Stéphane and Victor are being held prisoner by Mostefai and Mohamed Agad, the two young radicalized Frenchmen for whom death is a pleasure.
As I sat down, I see a second man, a second terrorist, in fact. He's yelling abuse at the people in the mosh pit. He says, "If anyone moves, I'll kill them." And as soon as he says it, there's a shot, so in fact he's just done it. And he's laughing and he says, "I told you not to move."
And at this point, there are two of them. The third guy's still on the stage. And then he starts telling us why he's here.
We are the Islamic State. We're here to avenge our families in Syria. It is thanks to your president, you have him to thank, that we're here in Paris to do the same as he's doing in Syria. Meanwhile, the other terrorist continues shooting people down. He continues to amuse himself by shooting people and killing them.
It was total chaos in Paris. Police and first aid workers got busy helping the victims of cafe terraces that had been attacked. 10 minutes had passed since the beginning of the attack, and the spectators in the Bataclan were trapped. Alerted by radio just before 10 p.m., two police officers from the anti-crime brigade, known as the BRI, finally arrived in the Bataclan. A divisional police commissioner and his assistant. They were not equipped to deal with automatic war weapons, and yet they decided to act. It was 9:59 p.m. The commissioner that we see in these images recounts, "Given the urgency of assisting the people who remained within the building, we entered into the lighted concert hall. Several hundred people were lying on the ground. We didn't know if they were alive or dead." The men weren't afraid to go in. They were all alone. They entered the Bataclan and they took an enormous risk. But it was they who stopped the shooting. When they arrived near the bar, the police officers saw Sami Amimour standing on the stage about 20 meters away. He was aiming his Kalashnikov. They fired 6 times with their handguns. It was 10:07 p.m.
We heard someone below shout, "Get out, get out!" And then 3 gunshots. We didn't understand. We couldn't see, we could only hear.
The only thing we knew was that they had most likely hit him, and that before he died, he'd had the reflex to trigger his vest and blow himself up. All of a sudden, we heard an explosion.
I saw something like confetti in the air, like at the end of a concert, small colour confetti. And I said to myself, that's odd.
I saw that Arnaud had a piece of flesh in his hair. It really was a piece of flesh. It was something quite soft.
What my brain refused to admit was that this confetti wasn't confetti. It was blood and bits of flesh that were flying around, highlighted by the lights in the room. The 2 terrorists who were with us appeared rather satisfied. They said that the 3rd terrorist had died as a martyr, and that they were very content. It was then that they told us that we were to move elsewhere. They pointed to a corridor and told us to go over there.
By entering and neutralizing the first terrorist, who was still in the pit, the police officers had stopped the others, and it was then that they began taking hostages. After the action taken by the commissioner, Mohamed Agad and Mostefai regrouped their 12 hostages and led them towards the end of the balcony in a corridor closed by a door, a trap about 1.5 meters wide by nearly 10 meters long.
There were a dozen of us. They put 3 of us in front of the 2 windows in the corridor so that they were protected from any snipers that they thought would be deployed on the roof of the opposite building.
They picked Caro, Greg and me to watch at the door. So we listened. We put our ears to the door and we listened for the least sound that might come from the balcony.
I was facing the window. There was this bald man next to me. It was Stefan. On my right, there was a guy who was a little taller than I. And on my left, there was a guy who was smaller than I, David. I wanted to get closer to him and to make some human contact. We didn't know each other. We'd never met. But David took my hand and said, "It'll be all right." And at the moment I took his hand, I knew it'd be okay. I told him, "It's all right. It's going to be okay. We'll get out of here." Then he broke the window with his weapon and started shooting outside. The smaller terrorist continued firing through the window. He fired and fired, then he laughed. I killed one while he was on the phone. What was he thinking?
We didn't see how, technically and operationally, the police could possibly rescue us without any risk to the hostages.
It was then that I thought about being shot by the police. I thought, okay, it's a police bullet, it's not so serious.
It was a deadly game for the Islamist suicide bombers. They shot at the inhabitants of the nearby buildings as well as at the police. And the crime squad officers fired back with pump-action shotguns.
I don't know if it was the stress, a reaction to the stress, but I suddenly began to laugh. I wasn't laughing out loud, it was just a small chuckle.
Then suddenly he burst out laughing. And I began to wonder if he wasn't completely off his rocker.
At that point, I thought that this guy must be suicidal.
Remembering the joint, I thought to myself, okay, the mixture of the joint and this stress, it must be a little overtaxing on the nerves. So I said to myself, man, that's just great.
And then he looked down at me and said, "So you think it's funny? Come on, get out of line, get near the stairs." And then I turned my back on him.
He aimed at him and fired. I only saw a strand of hair flutter, and I said to myself, because I'd expected to see his brain explode.
I turned around and he goes, "The next time you laugh, I'll throw you out the window." It was a close call.
10:15 p.m. The anti-crime brigade officers arrived on the scene and were deployed around the Bataclan. They had bulletproof vests, visored helmets, 35 kilos of equipment. The anti-crime squad, or the BRI, was an elite unit that had initially been created to fight against armed robbery, but today it also specializes in resolving crises involving hostages. There was chaos all around us. There were policemen, there were firemen. We had to try to organize everything, and my first concern was to set up a command post. Around the Barometre Cafe, where there was by now a makeshift hospital, the police established a command post. No one yet knew where the terrorists were, nor how many there were. The fear was that they had placed explosives throughout the building. At 10:30 p.m., the first BRI team entered the Bataclan. In front of them there was a tangle of hundreds of bodies. There were no cries. The wounded hardly dared to breathe. The living had to be sorted from the dead. But it was feared that the bodies might contain concealed explosives. I very quickly entered the Bataclan, and I was surprised to find myself stepping over people, over bodies, without realizing that they were dead. But I stepped over them as if they were pieces of wood. I was only thinking about my mission, and that was to liberate the hostages and neutralize the terrorists. It took 45 minutes to secure the ground floor. Then the two BRI columns arrived at the balcony, one from the right and one from the left. Opposite the door to the left corridor, the column was stopped by shouting. First we secured the ground floor. We evacuated it. Then we secured the first floor, the balcony. It was then that we first came into verbal contact with the hostage takers.
They told us to shout. "We have explosive vests. We'll blow them up if you come any closer. We'll blow them up and everyone will die."
They told me to shout. So I shouted, "He's got a weapon with an explosive belt." I shouted as loud as I could, even louder than at my craziest rock concerts. And I thought, how are they going to get inside? The corridor was very small. We were in the middle of it, and the terrorists were in the middle of us. It just wasn't possible. How could they do it?
Negotiation was imperative. Negotiation was going to be operational. It was going to allow us to make contact, to gain time, and to organize the operation. And we knew very well, given what had taken place, that there was very little chance that these terrorists were going to surrender voluntarily. At 11:27 p.m., the chief BRI negotiator made contact with the hostage-takers who claimed to be soldiers of the caliphate. After the second contact, the negotiator informed his superiors that he didn't think that he could obtain a surrender.
We realized very soon that they were completely out of their depth. They didn't have a plan. No plan at all. They were totally incompetent in that respect. They were here, but they had no objective.
The terrorists demanded that François Hollande sign a letter stating that he would remove all French troops from military theatres in Syria and Iraq. And that's when we realised that we were in real trouble, as there was absolutely no chance of that ever happening.
Then I see that the terrorist nearest me was holding a small metal cylinder in his hand. A cylinder with a small push button. The type of thing that students make in shop class, a stupid little thing. But I distinctly saw wires running from the cylinder and up the sleeve of his sweatshirt. And then I realized that, okay, this wasn't a bluff.
The BRI officers knew what was awaiting them. They had already analyzed the debris of the bomb from the first suicide bomber. A detonator, 2 electric wires, and TATP. Triacetone triperoxide, mixed with bolts and metal bearings, a mixture known as the mother of Satan. We went to see the chief of police, and when we told him that we were going to begin a counterattack, he asked, "Do you think that things will work out well?" No, sir. It can't go well. You'll have to anticipate important collateral damage for both the hostages and the police. The BRI columns were in position and ready to move in. At 18 minutes past midnight, the negotiator made an ultimate appeal to the two terrorists. In reality, a mere diversion, for the order to attack had already been given.
There was a bang on the door and a shot came through the door.
A shot to surprise, a shot to unnerve.
And then there was a panic reaction. All of us hostages, we began to shout, "Don't come in, they'll blow themselves up."
Bang! There was a bang on the door. It was crazy. A deafening sound.
And I thought, what are they doing? They're not trying to get in, are they? If they try that, then we're fucked.
And a bullet came through the door and frightened the terrorists. There was now a panic reaction amongst them. They tried to take cover. And in the time it took them to do so, the door burst open and we saw the cops, armed to the teeth. And we went in behind a ballistic shield. With the door broken down, the policemen, protected by a shield, advanced in single file down the narrow corridor where the hostages were being held prisoner. We were immediately caught under sustained fire by the terrorists.
I saw the smaller terrorist point his Kalashnikov towards the door and fire. He totally emptied the magazine of his weapon.
Basically, he discharged his assault rifle at the cops, while we were caught in the crossfire.
The shield continued to advance. The terrorists fired and fired something like 27, 28 rounds.
It took about 30 hits, and so it saved our lives. The ballistic shield, called Ramses, that was used at the Bataclan is now exposed as a relic at the BRI headquarters. Its Kevlar surface stopped 27 rounds of 7.62 assault rifle fire. This 100-kilogram shield effectively protected the officers during their gun battle with the soldiers of the Caliphate. There was no question of just firing blindly. We had to shoot very precisely in order to repel the adversaries. We tried to mask our progression by smoke screens and such. We used every means possible.
On se donne tous les moyens.
About half a dozen flashbangs covered the progression of the officers.
Stun and flash grenades exploded in the corridor. 5 or 6. There were 5 or 6. They seemed to have gone off everywhere. I could hardly see or hear anything.
We kept going forward, but we lost this shield.
The smaller terrorist grabbed me by the sleeve and said, You come with me. And he led me down the corridor at gunpoint.
In the confusion, the ballistic shield fell to the floor, and the officers had to advance without any protection. Amid the smoke, the leading officer spotted Mostefai, who was slightly to one side in the corridor. In an instant, he aimed at the terrorist with his handgun, a Glock. And there was a policeman right in front. Amid all that smoke, he saw the terrorist and fired at him. Hit by 2 shots, Mostefai fell to the ground. He was obviously hit.
He was searching for something. He was searching for a cable. He searched, then he touched his pocket, still searching, and put his hand on something, and then I have no recollection of afterwards. I was on the floor, then I was in the air.
Like everyone else that night, I was enormously lucky. Mostefai's explosive belt was projected towards the ceiling and not around the room. The explosion spared all the hostages, but Mohammed Agad, the second terrorist, was hit by the blast and riddled with shrapnel. The second terrorist was still alive, but the blast had turned his vest around. The trigger was near his hip, and he never found the button. And so he was neutralized. 2 fatal shots stopped Mohammed Agad, who was trying to detonate his bomb.
I felt a sort of force. Somebody grabbed me by the hair and by the belt and projected me forward. I fell on all 4s near the door and the shield. Then I saw hostages under the shield.
When the shield fell, the police had to continue to advance. And they walked on the shield, but there were still people under it.
But I couldn't just leave it there. I considered us as a group. We had to leave together. I refused to leave it there like that. So I lifted up the shield that weighed between 150 and 200 kilos.
The shield was lying on top of Caroline, one of the hostages. David, still raging, lifted the 100 kilograms that held his friend prisoner. After that, the hostages who were held in the corridor called David the Incredible Hulk.
I left the corridor with her on my shoulders. And as I left, I thought to myself, I'm alive. Shit, I'm alive.
The assault itself lasted about 90 seconds. That's not bad, but it's still a minute and a half. And a minute and a half in hell.
So the first police officer, he told me to get out. Don't stop. Get out, that way. They were there like lighthouses in the ocean, a signal to follow. So we followed them. No one searched me or said anything, so I went down a stairway. Bodies. There were bodies everywhere, blood everywhere. It wasn't a concert hall anymore, it was a battlefield.
I call it the hill. It was a pile of corpses in the middle of the floor. It was appalling.
I was one of the first ones to get into the ground floor, the pit, and it was then that I realized that phones were ringing everywhere. I looked closer, and I saw the telephones. I saw the messages on the phones, from mothers, from fathers, messages from friends, and I was greatly upset by that. I thought to myself, people are calling and calling, but to no avail. These poor people are dead, and they will never talk to them again. When leaving the room, one of the BRI officers said these terrifying words, "I have seen Dante's Inferno."
There were policemen everywhere, and ambulances flying in every direction. There were shouts, there was a lot of movement, and there were people everywhere. Everyone was distraught, in fact.
It was a victory for the anti-gang officers, and a miracle. All the hostages were safe and sound, but the evacuation was far from over. Dozens of survivors, many wounded, now emerged from the theatre. They came from everywhere, and they all had to be searched, treated, and evacuated.
En fait, l'assaut n'est pas fini.
The raid wasn't over yet. The hostages who'd hidden had to be found. Many had hidden on the roofs or in other rooms. There were about 100 or so still to be found, still hiding in the ceilings, the sub-ceilings, places like that.
Then a trap door opened, very slightly. There was a light.
There's a small red dots of the rifles searching the area.
We shouted, "We're hostages!" No, we're not hostages. There are no enemies here. We're friends.
And then we knew that the evening was not yet over. We had to get out. And there aren't that many ways out of the Bataclan. We had to go past the mess outside. Lily was trying to get down from the second level. An officer tried to warn her, but he was too late. She had put her hand on...
And then I realized I'd put my hand on human flesh. Because it was too late, I
immediately understood what it was. I'd made the link with the sounds I'd heard before. One of the terrorists had triggered his vest.
When we arrive at the bar, I see a young blonde girl. Young, 20 to 25.
In my mind, she has her eyes closed. She seems not to have suffered.
She was sleeping. For me, she was sleeping.
It's that face I see each time. This young woman.
Apart from the odours of blood and gore, there's this acrid smell of powder. It was appalling. The only desire was to get out into the open air. When we arrive at the entrance of the Bataclan, there were policemen everywhere. And we breathe the air. Parisian air has never smelled so good.
It was a return from a journey to hell. They searched for each other. They found each other. They embraced. But on that night, the 13th of November at the Bataclan, 90 people lost their lives.
As soon as I got on the street, there were cameras everywhere. And a row of men in black suits surrounding the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo.
They left the building. I met them. I saw David.
She asked me, rather emotionally and shocked, "How are you?" And I answered back very coldly, "Not all that great, really."
I think the only words that I was able to speak at that moment were perhaps a little stupid sounding. But I think that we all cling to small things that appear to be banalities. What's true in a moment like this is that not the form of the banality, but the concern for another's well-being.
Then she asked me, "Where were you?" And I answered, "I was with the terrorists." Anne Hidalgo was the first person that night who asked me how I was.
It was both the only thing that I could say and an encounter that will remain forever in my heart. And each time that I think of it, I have the same feeling of having had to deal with one of my own children. And to see him there, to see him alive, that's the real proof that the others have lost.
Alva Berglund, 23 ans.
In the courtyard of the Invalides, a solemn tribute is paid to the 130 victims of the terrorist attack of the 13th of November. An attack claimed by the Islamic State. A list of names is slowly read one by one, a moving list of broken lives.
On the 27th of November, in the Cour d'honneur of the Invalides, the names of all the victims are read in alphabetical order. And I clearly saw the moment when my name might have been read, but it was not pronounced. And it was then that I realized that I was still alive, that I was not dead. It was only then that I could truly start to mourn.
Where have you gone again, my sweet? Everybody wants...
It's a requiem that David sings. Long, slow goodbye. A message of love to the dead and to the survivors.
And finally I asked, did they steal my soul that night? But 5 years later I realized that they didn't. That my soul is still the soul of a young Parisian rocker who will never give up the fight, who will always struggle, who will ensure that the human side remains.
David, Arthur, Marie, Stéphane, Sébastien, Victor, Nicolas and Emilie. Survivors, but also victims. A new family. Together they were trapped, and together they remain standing.
I think that's true for me as well as for the other hostages. Our initial humanity, our human fellowship in opposing these two terrorists has never abandoned us, and that's still the case today. We continue to be strong people, strong and united against adversity, and so, no, that night no one stole my soul.